Hey, Robert. Fancy meeting you again. Hey, David. What's the reading today, guys?
David David, I'm on my phone. Can you send it in the chat?
The what, sorry?
The reading today?
The reading is the same as last week. It's the Kant, but sure, I'll post to you right now. That's fine.
Thanks.
No problem. 1 second.
Oh, wow. Payam joins us.
Oh, yes. This one. So you want the Kant views? Sure. Okay. I'll post it in chat. And hopefully Rose will join us as well. So Robin, what have you read? Have you read any of this material at all? Have you encountered it at all? Or?
No, this is outside of my domain for sure.
Ah, okay. Hey, Pam, welcome. Hey, Rose.
Hi, good morning.
How are you all doing? It's all good?
Good.
We're getting pretty much out there with this one. Rose, you're interested in following on. Why don't you kind of lead us off as to what you were curious about and thinking about when we were winding up last time, and we can go from there. I've got some pictures and text and stuff, but I'm just curious as to where you were going as opposed to me just railroading the whole thing. So
Can we go back to figure one?
sure, no problem.
Because I feel like this is sort of what he's trying to add to the whole thing. Okay. And I guess I don't know that because we have problems with figure one. It's hard to sort of
figure two.
Right. Yeah, further up.
Further up?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm driving for you, so whatever you want to.
So can you show figure one?
Sorry, yeah, I think there was a latency, which is why.
Oh. Okay. Yes.
Yes.
So if I'm reading this correctly, they're saying that Kant introduced the idea of intuition, and intuition is separate from sensation.
Correct.
Right? And so it's something that's not empirical, right? We haven't experienced it. And we don't have smaller concepts to describe it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he is saying that's what space and time both are.
Yes. Nicely put, yes.
So it's this intuition, and then like, what is that? It's not a feeling. It's not something that we can sense about the world, right? And we're saying it is cognitive. We're thinking it, right? And we're not building it from the ground up. We're not saying, okay, it's made from this and this and this and this.
Right.
It's just something that we have to.
Okay, so let's take system one in McGilchrist's version of it, which is the non-linguistic part of the brain. So the non-linguistic part of the brain has a representation that it has of the world, and it speaks to us through non-verbal means in terms of system one experience, feelings and things like that. I think that's what he's trying to get at. He's trying to say that information can exist in system two in a way that we can have it as a concept which we can then use reductionist principles to break down into components and relations. However, that style of representation requires linguistics. It is a linguistic construction. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have a linguistic construction to assemble the component parts of a concept or decompose a concept into component parts, then we're left with an intuition. So an intuition is kind of a gestalt or a total kind of summation, if you will, of the object. We can then pass that over to system 2, and system 2 can break that down into, you know, stories and pieces and parts and things like that. I think what he's trying to say is exactly what McGilchrist is trying to say, is that things emerge as intuitions first, right? And then we can then pass those over to system 2 and break them down as concepts into component parts using reductionist principles. So that's my understanding, at least. Payam, what do you think? You're muted, I think. Not hearing you. Not sure why I'm not hearing you. No, still no audio from you for some reason. Very odd.
No?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, sorry, I had to pick the right. It's a new computer. I just set it up. So.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. Just the other thing that might be a little bit confusing from this chart is, I think a key feature of intuition is that it's unconscious as to how you got it. I mean, it looks like it's in the conscious side on this graph, but I think he means conscious and conscious differently here. Intuition, I think, is just you get a sensation or you get a feeling of the result. And that's only that.
Yeah, you dropped out there. Sorry, we didn't catch any of that.
Again?
Sorry.
How far did you get? Did you hear me?
We heard you up to the point where you were saying that you agreed with what I was saying, but then you wanted to make some other finding of the
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that intuition is often unconscious because
Yes.
you don't know how you got that intuitive feeling or intuitive result. This diagram seems a little bit because he uses the word conscious and unconscious differently. So it looks like intuition is on the conscious side, but I think all he means is the result of the intuition is conscious, but how you got there, it must be unconscious, right?
Sure. Or if we had a feeling that didn't even rise into quote unquote consciousness. So let's say that consciousness is the point at which system 2 becomes aware of something that system 1's trying to tell it. Okay. If system 1 just deals with it and you don't even know, then it's an unconscious thing, right? If you take a step as you're walking down the street, it's not a conscious act in the sense that you're not, you know, you don't have it in mind, if you will. You're not trying to grasp where you're going to put your foot. So that's unconscious. Whereas if I get an eerie feeling about something that system 1 thinks I should bring into consciousness, then it can elevate it, perhaps, I'm suggesting. But yeah, interesting. So Rose, does that answer your kind of question?
I don't know if it's worth belaboring this or not, but one thing that's interesting to me about this is that McGilchrist talks a lot about the idea of the unconscious representing real things in the world, right? And I think, I'm not sure about this, maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think space and time are not in there. We don't structure things in the same way. We don't think about objects in place in space and in a sequence in the unconscious mind. And so it's interesting that he puts it like this too, where it's actually, it's conscious. Space and time are, they're conscious constructs, not unconscious constructs.
Yes, they are tools of system 2. Yeah, as we describe them, because we're using language. I've got some bad pictures that might be useful, they might not, but I'll share them anyway. Yeah, so this is what I'll just give the others a quick kind of recap. So what Kant is trying to say is that our conception of time and our conception of space are in our mind only. Okay, so we perceive some multidimensional hyperparameter space out there in the real world, which we cannot perceive all of it. And he makes this distinction with what he calls sensibility versus the thing in and of itself, right? So we can't see the Klein bubble, but we can sense it in a two-dimensional sense. And then this gets mapped into internal representations that we have in our head of space and time. Okay, so Kant's explicit position is that the most fundamental of all is time. So we order things in time, and his depiction of time is that we can't have two objects either being and not being at the same point in space, at the same point in time, but we can have an object being there or not being there in the same point in space at different points in time, right? So he's trying to say that time is fundamental as a representational motif in our mind, and then we can layer in space on top of that as a secondary piece, and then I think that the realist's view is that there really is out there space and time, and we are simply transposing space and time from out there directly into our mind. So we actually have a correct model of reality in our mind, and we can reconstruct it. And we are essentially representing reality in miniature in our own perception. So they're the pictures I drew. They're not particularly relevant to your point, but I'm not sure. So you're suggesting that there's something else over here, and I'll just modify this picture very briefly just to try and see if I've got the idea. You're saying that there's something else over here. Whoops, that didn't work. There's something else in here, which is the system one intuition, if you will. So we have some shape, insert shape, some weird shape. So over here we have the intuition, right? And it has some other representation again. Okay, so the intuition has some representation that we don't know, right? It's a black box representation like a neural network. But if something arises out of that intuition, then it will trigger system 2 to try and represent the intuition of space and time. I think that's what Kant is trying to get at. I could be wrong.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And so is the intuition even coming from, like, if we link this back to the Hume stuff,
Right.
It's almost like ability to imagine something comes forward first. And then if you can imagine it, then you start to create some construct for it cognitively.
Right.
And so you start to create these structures around it. And that's all a cognitive process, right? And I guess what I wonder about then is once you've created those structures, if they become ingrained enough in the way you look at things, do they then get wrapped back into some representation in the unconscious mind so that that's
Yes.
then just the way you see the world, right? So as opposed to believing that everything in the in the unconscious mind is truly, truly there, like they're real things, maybe it's just habituated by the,
Right.
the cognitive
Yes.
constructs that we have created.
Yeah. So am I correct in interpreting your question as system 1 can bring perceptions into consciousness, which we can then process with system 2? And you're asking a very interesting question, which is, how does system 2 then pass information back to system 1, if you will?
Well, I think you're saying that you think that it starts with system 1, it starts unconscious.
That's right.
And then we form, I guess I wonder if it even does, right? If you have nothing to put it, you have nothing to start it with, right? You're not seeing it, it's not there. But then there's something with imagination that allows you to, there's something that pushes you to try and create structure around something. And then that gets repopulated back again. So that then in the future, right, that's where the prior knowledge comes in.
But do you think you can even imagine anything without any initial constructs? I don't think that's possible. Maybe it's just already ingrained in our brains when we're born, or something that's just there, that's ready to make sense of the whatever sensory experiences we're receiving. Yeah, I can't, I guess it's really hard to imagine, but I can't imagine you can imagine without any construct, like completely empty.
I mean, I think that's the process of learning, isn't it? Right, like if you talk about like your view of the world, right, as a physicist, you would imagine different things than I would imagine, right?
Sure,
You're
but there
building
is a lot of,
upon-
sure, but there's a lot of stuff in the background, right, that you already know, even from just like childhood, and since you were born, you already have, you don't start blank. Like a human being is not a blank slate when they start.
Mhm.
I agree. Very interesting.
So that's the Chomsky
Yeah, I was just going to
universal
say Chomsky.
language, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are structures in there already. And I mean, I think this is what we're kind of bumping up against, right? He talks a lot about like rats and prime number mazes and stuff that we just don't have the physical construct, or it's possible that we just don't have the constructs to understand some of the stuff that we're trying to understand.
As an aside, for future readings, if people were interested in kind of learning about Chomsky's philosophy, like linguistics philosophy, I'm not particularly interested in his political philosophies, but like, yeah, his general kind of his ideas from linguistics be interested in going to. I just want to bookmark that.
Are they accepted? I don't know much about it. Is it a controversial, like, do linguists generally accept what he proposed, or is it like a controversial thing?
They're seminal, right? In the sense that Freud is seminal, but also they're more accepted than Freudian ideas are accepted.
Okay.
He's got some there's a like the Chomsky hierarchy, for example. That's a formal hierarchy, right? Like that's something that people use. And there's algorithms based on Chomsky stuff like that are in your phone. So like a probabilistic concept, a concept-free grammar or a probabilistic concept-free grammar. Those are based on Chomsky's theories, and those are machine learning models that we use. Well, I don't know if anybody uses them, but they're established.
Interesting. Was he influenced by Boltzmann as well? Does he use any of the statistical stuff that Boltzmann came forward with, or is his just as more of a kind of a psychology, kind of a philosophical argument?
I don't know. It's my father is an was an English professor, and and a big part of what he did was linguistics, and so most of my exposure to kind of Chomskyism was through his explanations of linguistics, and it wasn't until as an adult I started studying machine learning and natural language understanding that I realized that there was a whole quantitative literature based on what he's done, and so I've always my knowledge of his kind of like linguistics ideas along the lines of things you've already said, like for example we're born with some innate, in other words, like so he observed that for the speed at which we learn language is too fast. Like the amount of, like, if you quantify it in terms of information theory, like we learn too much for it to be learned all from scratch. Like there has to be some kind of innate structure that it's building upon, and that was a theory based on like math, as opposed to just kind of like waving your hands in the sky and saying that this must be true. And there's a formal hierarchy, like the difference between a Chomsky hierarchy. There's another guy's name in there, but I can't remember. It's a long name. But the difference between like a context, so like a basis, like a basic kind of graphical, like a basic context specific the Chomsky hierarchy starts with like something like a BaseNet, like a kind of closed logical system, and then you have a context-free grammar, and then you have a context-specific grammar. You know, so it talks about the different kinds of things that you can express in those systems. Yeah, it'd be interesting to dive into that stuff. You know, and like Neil Stevenson's whole, like, you know, if you ever read what's the book with the metaverse that Neil Stevenson wrote?
Snow Crash.
Snow Crash, right? And so like there's this whole thing in Snow Crash about like some Sumerian language that is like the idea that there's some kind of basic, I think the term in the book is called Namshub or something like that, but it's this idea of a basic language that is the kind of operating system language of the brain, and everything else is like all other languages are just high level languages to that low level, that get compiled to that low level root language. Those are all Chomsky-esque ideas that I think we could sink our teeth into. Anyway, I didn't want to derail the conversation.
No, it's right on track.
I mean, on the same vein, I mean, another person that might be interested is Wittgenstein, right? Like he said a lot of things about representation and language, and what are like a lot of the things we find confusing is just because of language, the limitations of language. Some of his stuff is like impossible to read. I tried to read Tractatus. I have no idea. I think he said famously, if you read it and understand it, it's for you. If you don't, it's not for you. So, and it wasn't for me, I guess. Like I had no clue what he was talking about.
Yeah, I read a good chunk of a different book of his, which was also very much an attack on language. I'm just looking it up here. Oh goodness.
Chomsky has a very accessible, pretty recent what kind of creatures are we?
Yeah, he's still going.
He's still going.
Discusses a lot of ideas.
Yeah, I think he's on the, what's his name? The guy who dresses like Men in Black, does machine learning podcast.
Lex.
Lex, yeah.
And he was also on another one, which is The Theory of Everything. No, definitely we could explore that. My personal position is a little bit strange and unusual and completely unjustified, but so I actually think that we have priors encoded in our DNA in the sense, not in the sense of some mystical memory thing, but just in the sense of a pure lookup table where if we are presented with some stimulus, it will cause a transcription network to fire, and that will then generate some biochemical, which will have a system-wide effect, right? So essentially, we don't come into the world without priors. Our priors are in our DNA, and if we smell roses for the first time, then that might cause us to generate some protein, which will actually change how we think and what we do. And I think that's what Snow Crash is trying to get at, is that these linguistic forms can actually trigger a genetic response, and we can essentially orchestrate those genetic responses to program people or to take advantage of people, like marketing, things like that. So Facebook is inadvertently exploiting this mechanism with their ad system, trying to drive traffic. What they're really doing is they're essentially accidentally finding these signals that trigger these genetic emotional responses in people that will lower their propensity to engage system 2, and they'll make lots of silly mistakes using system 1. That's completely unjustified. I don't have any evidence for that. I'm just kind of sharing my intuition around how that might unfold. Oh, we lost.
We can read a bunch of as like all those books and like blogs about like, you know, how to like pick people up with neuro-linguistic programming.
Right. So so the underlying principle there is that if you can trigger some low-level genetic response, you can actually influence their behavior in a literal sense. But I don't have any evidence for this, and it's very early. So, but that's kind of where my intuition sits these days on that, is that we don't come into the world as a tabula rasa. We have 4 billion years of experience, but the mechanism by which we can access those priors is very indirect and very nebulous. So,
Quick question: what does that metaphor mean to tabula rasa?
So it just means blank slate.
Okay.
Yeah, it just means you come into the world literally, and if you were, born into the body of a silicon-based life form on the surface of the sun, your consciousness would be no different, and you would start from that experience and move forward. And I'm suggesting that that's not the case. Is that definitely not the case? That we have this genetic legacy that we have to live with, and that genetic legacy has as much to do with our consciousness as our experience in the world. So.
A follow-up question. So going back to Kant, I was curious, just as a food for thought, what people thought of the ideas about intuition in Kant's definition. And so we've people talk about it, we previously talked about the ability for something like in neural nets to learn structure in the world that humans have yet to perceive or to notice and quantify. I wonder if, insofar as the spirit of this conversation, these conversations kind of connect back to what problems that we're looking at today. Is there a connection there, or is that unrelated, do you think?
I mean, I can respond, but Payam, do you have any comments? Or?
Well, I don't know if I have anything beyond what everybody thinks. I mean, there's obviously a connection. I mean, we think that a neural network is a system one kind of thing. You run things through and you get an answer, and oftentimes you have no idea where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how good your GPU is, it's going to be fast.
I'm going to try an experiment. So maybe you, Payam, or you, Robin, since you're new and you might have a fresh take. So imagine that you're at a conference arguing with somebody about whether or not a neural network sophisticated enough to learn some structure of the data generating process that humans either haven't yet or are unable to learn because of our, the constraints on our worldview, and then ask if, and then use Kantian logic as a justification for that argument, and then see if it sits well in your mouth. As you're saying it, does it feel as though I feel I like the way these shoes fit. Or does it feel completely absurd? I sound like a complete twat right now because I'm saying that Kant's idea of intuition just.
Yeah, I'm not sure you want to mention Kant when you are arguing with somebody in a machine learning conference. You might lose credibility immediately.
Well, I don't know. Is that true? I mean, if this is the problem that I have of machine learning researchers, which is just why do you think you've invented all of science in the last 5 years? Or of logical discourse, or it's these are old problems, and we have words to describe maybe some of the things that we're working with, and if we're going to solve artificial intelligence, we have to we can't throw away prior work. But maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, but the prior work, oftentimes, that goes back to Schmidhuber's things. He often goes back to papers from 1900 or 1850, and he wants to cite those as the first CNNs or something. But I mean, I guess in reality, oftentimes somebody could come up with an idea long in the past, but then it gets sort of rewritten, rethought of. Eventually, somebody finds a better way of expressing things, more simpler and in the modern language, and then people start citing that. I mean, that might not be I would say everything we've read so far on Kant is already. I wasn't surprised with anything. I didn't really learn anything. It doesn't mean that he didn't come up with it. I probably learned it indirectly through all the people who came after him and built everything on top of what he did, right? So I don't know if we get anything out of like citing Kant directly.
I guess like, I guess the example I give is Bayes, right? Like, to talk to your modern, like newly minted machine learning person, they think of Bayes as a kind of computational hack that you use to get like to do uncertainty quantification when you're on a neural net or something like that, and so they don't understand the entire kind of epistemological worldview that has been kind of developed over centuries that you're bringing to a modeling problem. And and for me, since I'm trained as a Bayesian statistician, it does shape the way I think about problems deeply. Like I think deeply about, for example, if I were modeling using a stochastic process to model the financial markets, I would have a clear distinction in my head between, what is uncertainty that I'm using probability to model uncertainty that I have about the system here, and I'm using probability to model inherent stochasticity in a random process there. And those two things are separate because something here is something that I don't know, and here's something that I consider to be based on a philosophical transition that I inherited through a training as a statistician. But for somebody who's new to statistics or was trained as a machine learning engineer, they don't know about that whole mental model. Now, I don't, now if Kant themselves if Kant were useful in fitting models, somebody would have discovered it before we did. But I guess I'm thinking like, I don't know. I just kind of want to try these ideas out. Like, so okay, Kant is calling a bunch of certain kinds of, he has some kind of epistemic concept called.
You cut off, Robert.
Cut out. Robert, are you there?
Now he's officially muted.
No.
Oh, sorry. Did I cut off?
Well, you
Yes.
muted, yeah.
Yes. Epicentric concept.
Yeah, so like, so Kant has some kind of epistemic concept called intuition, and maybe it's useful for quantifying this whole stuff about how neural networks can learn stuff that humans can't conceive of. I don't know, maybe try it out for size. That said, I do recognize that if I started
one of the issues,
CNNs and Kant, I would sound like a really a weirdo. But still,
the problems is like when baggage with lots of different people coming up with different ideas of it. Sorry, did I cut off again?
No, you're back now. That's fine.
Yeah, I'm just saying like the word intuition probably means something very different to us than to Kant because there's been these many years of people adding stuff to it. So it might be more confusing for us to understand Kant, whereas during his time, everybody maybe understood what he was talking about.
I don't think everyone understood what he was talking about.
No.
Sorry.
But going back to your original point, Robert, like arguing people in machine learning, like I wonder, like you can do the arguments in different levels, right? You can go philosophical and like be like Gary Marcus and try to argue whether these things in principle could work or not, or which I think a lot of the practitioners and researchers are not really interested in that. Like, or you could be practical, just say, you want to know if neural networks can learn something that humans couldn't. All you need is like one example of a case. Like if you can solve protein folding by using neural networks and humans could do it for a couple of decades, then that's your answer. Machine learning can solve something that humans couldn't, and that's it. There's no reason for philosophizing or coming up with reasons, or maybe we don't know why or how, but we already know that they did it. So we can that can be the starting point.
Yeah, I guess I might offer that in my area, or what I see of research more broadly, there is a strong preference for recent stuff. I've been amazed at how ideas percolate without a knowledge of the historical precedents of it.
Is that in economics?
Yeah, economics and finance, social sciences in general. You know, I've been at major conferences where people have represented their work as sort of new and original, and not just completely oblivious to stuff that went on before that was precisely the same thing. So, you know, I think we're going to see that in philosophy. I know we're going to see it in machine learning.
But to what extent do you think that's just like practical limitations of like our time? Like you don't have time to go read the entire history of economics before you start doing your work, right?
Well,
maybe you should, I don't know.
No, but it's kind of an attribute of how you've got people with these different perspectives or different knowledge of parts of the relevant history, and they basically don't communicate with each other. So in my area, it's kind of, you know, the young guys versus us old guys.
Right. Oh, well,
There's also domain
Yeah.
as well,
Go ahead,
right?
Ruben.
Like if we were having a conversation about Kantian ethics, we'd probably feel it a lot more relevant to kind of modern problems, the ethical problems, than Kantian metaphysics, considering, you know, we've come up with a lot of physics theory since then.
Also, it's difficult to make real progress in ethics if we seem to be going in cycles and circles depending on people's attitude towards different things. There is no objective truth that we are sort of converging on.
I think
So-
where it gets interesting from some of the stuff we've been talking about is if we think about an intuition as, we could even look at that as a machine learning output in some way, but then trying to translate that into concepts so that we can actually do something with an intervention that would cause things to turn out in a different way, right? We're starting with an intuition and we don't really understand what it is, but then we need to start to, like, then we basically start to imagine, is it this? Is it that? Is there this, latent variable out there that I haven't really thought about yet that's having an impact here? And that's when we start to convert that intuition into concepts and test our ideas a little bit.
That's the kind of the simulator in your head concept, where we are trying to have some model, like some linguistic or conceptual, reductionist model in our mind, and then we try and roll that forward, and then that presents a kind of a perception. We then hand that perception back to system one, and system one says that's not right, and then we say, oh, okay. So our essentially our utility function is system one. And it feeds us back with saying that doesn't smell right, or that, that seems plausible to system one. And so we have this kind of internal simulator, and we're building these causal models, we're building these constructions, and then we essentially, that produces a perception, like an imagined perception. But that imagined perception we can then essentially pass back and see if system one likes it or not. And then if system one likes it, then we will essentially start to believe that that is the correct answer. But then if we go out into the world and we test our model against actual real world data and it doesn't come back, then system one updates its priors, and then we have to rerun the simulation and start all over again with this new prior that we've given to our utility function, and round we go. So
But I think that's exactly where things go wrong. Like, I think in the example you gave, that makes perfect sense. That's sort of like there is an objective truth of the way reality works, the way physics works. You imagine a way it will work, you go test it out, you're either wrong or right, and you correct. But in most other things that I think Rose is concerned about, like if you imagine something and you're wrong, you could still help bring it about in the way you imagined it without it being the truth. It's just the fact that you imagined it and you made decisions based on your imagination is going to make it more true. So the truth actually depends on what you imagine and what actions you take. So it's not just discovery,
it's like
you're
exactly
influencing.
It's like literally how currency works.
For the markets and for that
Yeah,
in general,
exactly.
yeah.
But I think we can, what I would be interested in trying to understand is can we use machine learning to elicit an understanding of system one? That kind of sounds backwards, but in other words, can we probe, can we try and characterize our responses to various different stimuli by essentially allowing people to construct models in their mind and to explain things to us? And then can we use those explanations in a language model to try and understand the kind of triggered relation, the triggered responses that certain stimulus have on people, and then can we map that all the way back down to a gene or to a you know, to some sort of implicit bias that's built in? And if we could build a map of such biases, then I think that we would go a long way to understanding system one a lot better.
So that's what psychologists try to do.
They don't build very good models. I mean, I'm working with psychologists on my project, and the gap between my grasp of the material and theirs is vast. So there is I'm sure there are psychologists out there who study machine learning and are good at math. I'm not in any doubt, but not the ones that I interact with directly. But that doesn't, I don't interact with that many. But yeah, that's what psychology is trying to do, I guess. But I think that there's this other approach, which I think is kind of insidious, which is we use machine learning models. We create these black box models that study human behavior in terms of marketing. And we have no idea about what the consequences of that regime of stimulus is actually having on the people who we're exposing it to, right? We're kind of treating everyone like there's this wonderful scene in Animatrix where you know, the robots are probing human reactions, right? And so they're making people laugh and smile and be happy. And that's how I see machine learning at places. And I'm not trying to point fingers, but you know, when we have machine learning models hooked up to real people at scale, like YouTube and Facebook and other things, that's essentially what's going on. We're kind of probing this kind of underlying mechanic of system one and trying to find some series of things that we can do that will drive you to buy your product, right? Or to watch more TV or whatever it is. But there's no ethics, like there's nothing. It's just the machines trying to elicit a response. And if you buy it, then they'll do more of that. I don't think that's very wise. That's the experiment that we're all engaged in. So we'll see how it turns out, I guess. But very interesting. So we've kind of drifted far and wide here. Where do we want to kind of go next with this conversation? Do we want to look at Chomsky? I know nothing about him, which is probably a good reason why we should have a good look.
Could I pose one question to you, David? So what happens in that sort of machine versus human interaction if we get AI agents to represent ourselves?
So AI agents is an interesting one. Do the AI agents have a system one of their own? I don't think they do. They have no genetic heritage. And so they're essentially like an extension of our system too, right? They're playing cards, finite games, right? We set up boundaries, we set up reward conditions, and the agents are essentially just randomly sampling some distribution to generate behaviors, and then they will bias those behaviors over time based on experience. So they'll kind of build up a simple intuition that will allow them to respond. But the other thing that we can do with those agents is we can essentially enforce a system upon them, right? So we can tell them what the rules of the game are, and then they can manage the boundary conditions that we care about. So you could actually implement policy in that way. So you could imbue the agents with policy, and I mean like governmental policy or tribal policy or whatever it might be, and then they would act as a kind of another filter, another explanation, another source of explanations that you could bring into your internal dialogue, if it will. So the agent might say, this person's trying to sell you this thing, looks like you're very interested in buying it. Perhaps you should learn more about the effects of sugar on diabetes and not do that kind of thing. So there is a possibility of that, but that's also very, very easily hijacked by others so that your behavior is actually beneficial to them. So it is fraught with peril in that sense.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, as this, so I think what we've been doing with these kind of sticking to the contributions of philosophy and understanding what ancient sages meant and trying to contextualize it in kind of modern modeling. I think this is I really enjoying this track. If somebody could share a screen and maybe show like what Stanford Encyclopedia of Psychology or Philosophy has to say about Chomsky, and maybe there's some kind of area of his analysis that we could read. Another thing that I wanted to propose was so there's a short story. I think I shared it before, but it might be fun to, instead of reading some essay on some philosopher, we could read a good short story that has some compact ideas that could fuel conversation. There's a book, so if people might have heard of that book, The Three-Body Problem by Cysteine Liu, from Chinese author. It was translated by a guy named Ken Liu, who's an author in himself. He wrote a Paper Menagerie, series of books about something about kings or something. But he's got this short story called A Perfect Match. And it's about a guy who basically has a voice assistant. And basically, it's like her in the sense that you have like this ubiquitous kind of voice assistant that's helping you make decisions, and you're giving you recommendations for all your basic decisions. But it's not, he doesn't fall in love with it like in her. It's not, it's not some kind of corporate dystopia like in The Circle. But it's still a dystopia, because what's happening is in the sense that by kind of having all his decisions kind of be optimized, he ends up missing a lot of important things that he ought to be paying attention to. And I really enjoy the story in the sense that it almost reads as though like if you wanted to write you wanted to kind of write an analysis of what a good AI that was kind of representing humans in the way that Robert just suggested would sound like, you would take this story and kind of use it as the problem, and and then write the solution to the problem. So that if you can Google, yeah, that's a perfect match. It's a 10-20 minute read.
Sure.
I've already read that.
Like
yeah, that's a good story.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but yeah, that sounds good. So should we do that for next time then? That's fine by me.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I've been noodling about. Like, what would, like, what would the good version of the agent in this story be? Or like, so I'll pose one. So with respect to this story, I pose one kind of question to ask yourself, suppose we live in a world where, what are they called? Meta and all various algorithms are, various companies are using algorithms to kind of, and as we're learning, detrimental to and often just to health as well as social outcomes. And then so if you were going to create, say, some agent maybe that you owned that was basically going to act like a guardian to the kind of attack on your kind of heuristic decision makings that all these algorithms are constantly providing, what would that look like? And what would it have to do? What would it have to detect? What in what parts of your own mental states would it have to kind of capture? There were going to be some kind of what's the word for when you have a device, like a prosthetic, like if it were some kind of cognitive prosthetic that were going to be a kind of shield against the kinds of algorithms that are described in the story. What would that look like?
It's funny you guys are talking about this. This is like, I actually had a startup idea along these lines to basically have personalized, like almost like personalized recommenders where they would represent you against all the other recommenders that are run by companies and have different metrics. This one, you set the metrics, the data is collected locally, never leaves your device. Yeah, so there are technical issues with that, but I think that's a good, like, if everybody should have a digital representative to represent them in the internet or in the metaverse, and you train them or you set the parameters without letting anybody else know. And I think one of the things that I guess it would be interesting after we read this story, I wonder if you want them to be smart. Like I almost want them to be dumb. Like I want to tell the agent, I want all the articles, let's say, on particle physics every day. I don't want him to think if I want to read it, or would I click more on cat videos, so then he should show me more cat videos. I want to get what I want to get without it predicting what the future will be. So I wonder if the direction is counterintuitively to dumb these things down, not to make them smarter.
Or maybe like maybe smart in this context just means like things, there's that, I don't know who said it, but like things cease to be intelligent once you understand how they work. And so so once something becomes less smart once you've demystified it, and you're just like, oh no, it's just like, it just does this is the code and does this. And there's, yeah, so like, I mean,
I think it goes deeper, right? Like, I mean, this story, I don't remember the details. I'm not going to spoil anything, but so let's say you meet a new person and you're intrigued, you want to get to know them more, you want to go on a date, but then your recommender says, based on your psychology and what they know about that person, this is going to end bad. You should not do it. But I think we all agree, maybe you still want to do it, even though it's going to be really bad for you. You might still want to do it. So maybe that's like being wise, not smart. Or
maybe it's just explainable, like show me why you think it's going to be bad, and then it just like, so, well, we did some simulations and we got this outcome, and you're like, well, that's ridiculous, that would never happen. So like,
But even if it's accurate,
anyway,
right? You might still not care, right?
Absolutely.
If we understood our utility functions, it would be easy, right? But we don't.
As they're saying, maybe utility functions aren't real.
No, I think they're real.
Yeah.
I think that we use them, but I don't think we understand them. I think we create these rationalizations after the fact, but our real utility functions, I don't think we have a clue what they are. So it could be interesting. I mean, if we could try to understand that, like if we could try to find a representation of what our actions are really based upon. Same thing for companies, right? Companies try to tell us that they're promoting things to us for our good, but in actual fact, the utility is for the good of the company.
I mean, there are ways of trying to untangle what these utility functions are. For instance, in financial planning, people do it. They try and gauge tolerance of risk, aversion to downside losses. So, I mean, through a series of questions, you can kind of, I'm not saying you can do it precisely, but you can kind of, at least move in the right direction.
Well, take Payam's example of like, do you go on a date with somebody or not? Like, try and explain that to me. Like,
Yeah.
Well, it kind of, okay.
It's based on geometry.
It's based on geometry. I mean, you got to do some epsilon searching too. You don't know what you don't know.
I mean, I think this comes back to the explore versus exploit, right? Like, how much do you do? How much do you do of each? And that's probably different for every individual in every circumstance. But I like your idea, Payam, that you could potentially create something that's better, that's more closely matched to the individual than having some corporation out there create a set of rules for you that basically
actually
exploits.
That's a good thread, like explore versus exploit. So I'm wondering, like, let's say you have the perfect objective function, you discover it, there's no error in it. I'm arguing even in that case, you don't want to just exploit. You still want to explore and know that you're going to lose some points. And that's the essence of life. Like, you don't want to optimize everything to death, even if you know the utility function perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, truly believe that the more uncomfortable you are in life, ultimately the richer your life is, right? If you're too comfortable, you're not.
Yeah, there's something to that. Like,
yeah, I'm like okay with comfort.
Decision rule in terms of picking.
But I think you can argue the other way, that maybe you don't have the right utility function if perfect exploitation is not the right thing to do. It means your utility function is something different that you don't know. Maybe it's like a moving target. I don't know.
Well, so like one of the things I was talking about in the agent modeling course earlier today was, there's the idea that agent, so a lot of the algorithms that that live in the world, we rely on the assumption that utility functions exist and that they are static. And so like the recommendations that you serve up in response to what you've learned about that function, you assume it doesn't actually affect that function. But there might be some kind of feedback loop between the function, the recommendations that you serve to the agent and their utility function. So for example, serving somebody some, political content might push them in the direction of seeking out more extreme political content. But also, like, I've been reading some stuff in the neuroscience literature recently about is kind of disputing this idea that kind of underpins everything, which is that utility functions exist as if like there's some kind of hard-coded value function in your brain, when from what we know about neuroscience and computational psychology, heuristics are kind of how we make decisions often, and those heuristics are dependent on circumstance and the company and the time of day and all these things. So like maybe it's useful to think more in terms of heuristics than utility, in general. So I mean, these are the kind of conversations I hope we have when we read this short story. Anyway.
Cool. Very good. All right. Well, we're coming up to time, so very good discussion today. Any closing comments from anyone? So I'll post a link to the short story in the channel, and let's pick it up next week.
Bye, everyone.
By the way, it was you, Rose, who taught me to be skeptical about, because when we first talking about utility functions, you would just constantly call them into question, and like and eventually it just ate away at me, and now I don't believe in utility functions anymore. Thanks to you. Thank you.
Nicely done. Okay, take care.
See you next week.
All right, thanks everybody.
Yeah. Bye.